You're listening to the Rainmaking Podcast, hosted by high-stakes headhunter, author, and professional speaker, Scott Love.
You're listening to the Rainmaking Podcast, and my name is Scott Love. Thank you for joining me on the show. Our guest today is Jacob Parks, and our topic is the anatomy of a rainmaking organization. Jacob and I go pretty deep on how organizations function and what you can do to improve yours. If you're in the business of getting business, this is an episode that you don't want to miss. Let me tell you a little bit about Jacob. He's a very impressive individual. He's a president of strategy for PI, Profitable's Idea Exchange. He's also the author of Never Say Sell, a guide to how professional firms expand their business with key clients. Jacob's the real deal. He's done the work. He also leads the PI Professional Services CMO and CGO network, and is a graduate of Gonzaga's MBA program, having previously taught undergraduate business students. He's led client teams for McKinsey, Accenture, and KPMG, among others. I hope you get some great ideas from my conversation with Jacob. I've put all of his contact information, including his LinkedIn link and his company link, on the show notes. So no matter where you listen to the show, go to the show notes and you'll be able to connect with Jacob directly. As always, this show is sponsored by Leopard Solutions, Legal Intelligence suite of products, Firmscape, and Leopard BI. Push ahead of the pack with the power of Leopard. And now here's my conversation with my friend, Jacob Parks. Thanks for listening. Hey, this is Scott Love with the Rainmaking Podcast. I've got a special guest today. I'm really excited about this topic. And our topic is the anatomy of a rainmaking organization. And our guest is Jacob Parks. Jacob, thanks for joining me on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Scott. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yes, so let's get right into it, man. So the anatomy of a rainmaking organization, what does that look like? How would you describe that? Let's kind of get started with some definitions. What do you think the ideal rainmaking organization looks like?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, Scott, although I don't think it's that easy to define. Traditionally, I think we spend a lot of our time talking about people who do great business development and professional services as rainmakers, and appropriately so. But too often, I think we focus on the individual, and the focus on the individual sort of lends itself to some of our corny sales cliches that in professional services we really want to avoid. And so I always talk about this, but what we don't want to have are people saying things like, I can sell a ketchup popsicle to a woman in white gloves, or I can sell a furnace in the Mojave Desert. All of that is like, those analogies are wholly inappropriate to our world. And in fact, I think a lot of times when I see great rainmakers, they're not necessarily the outgoing, gregarious star that you think they are. They're contemplative, thoughtful client delivery people. And
Absolutely
so
right.
We've sort of tried to learn a lot about what rainmakers look like. But interestingly to me, there are a bunch of institutional barriers that exist when it comes to building a fully fledged rainmaking organization. Having a few that do it well can carry your firm forward. But I actually think moving toward world-class business development is having a cohesive team where everybody's kind of playing their role.
Absolutely. I think that is ideal, but institutional barriers. Let's kind of talk about that. What do you think are some of the more problematic and more common institutional barriers that you've seen?
Well, I think, so one is just the obvious kind of incentive part of delivering for clients. So, let's just say that you're an attorney and you have an $8 million book of business and, $6 million of that book is with one single client. And there are probably opportunities to introduce your litigation partners or your tax partners or other people into that opportunity, but you're paying for your nice house and putting your kids through college. The incentives don't necessarily line up for you to take on more risk with your trusted relationship in order to create value for the firm. And so I think there is sometimes just a natural resistance to doing it because I think that we are somewhat programmed to mitigate risk as opposed to seize opportunity. So I think that's a big part of it. I actually think that there's like a what do my partners do problem as well.
What do you mean by that? Again, let's tee this up as our second issue. The first is the incentive part for delivering for clients. What's the second one?
The second one is just that we don't know everything that our partners do. So as you grow in your career in professional services, typically you build a business on a narrow niche. You start out as an associate delivering hours and doing different kinds of projects. And then in order to become partner and build a practice, you might have a very specific niche on some type of law. Well, you don't know every single niche that your partners do. And so the idea that you're going to cross-sell other opportunities for your partners is hard to do if you don't understand it. And so how do we fix that? It's incredibly difficult. And I think that, that probably brings me to my next challenge, which is the technology challenge, which is the technology that we have for business development, the tech stack that exists with CRM and outreach tools and all of these different things is incredibly powerful, and it never gets taken advantage of.
Yeah. Yeah. Why do you think that is? I mean, I kind of know the answer.
Nobody puts information into CRM. I was talking actually to an attorney this morning, a partner in a firm, and he was saying, there are some weeks when I work 70 hours a week on a litigation case or something like that. The idea that I'm going to go home at the end of that and put multiple fields into Salesforce or into whatever the CRM system is just not likely. But I think that there's really good news on this subject, which is that I do believe that this is one of the areas that AI is going to solve on our behalf. We are not that far from, let's say I'm having a conversation with you, Scott, and you're like, geez, this person out in Texas is suing me for something I did. And these are kind of the factors. In real time, we're going to be able to sort of query our AIs internally and say, lawsuit, Texas, oil rights, or whatever the case may be, and be able to spit out in real time, this is the work we've done, this is the right partner to introduce, and here's a case study or a story that might reflect how we can serve this client. I actually think this challenge isn't that important over the next 10 years because I do think that there's a realistic chance that technology solves it and helps us. But I have one tip for people on this, which is to, rather than talk about what you do, the sort of mechanism by which you deliver value to your clients, and flip that on its head and try to get the firm to only talk about how you solve problems for clients. Not I do litigation, but I go in and I help people get the most outstanding outcome they possibly can when they confront an unfortunate situation with this, or this, right? And what that does is it positions everybody in the client's mind. They're all thinking about how clients' problems get solved. The intricacies of my unique practice of law or consulting or engineering are relatively unimportant. I just need to know, what the outcome is that you can deliver, because as a generalist in this particular specialty, I can talk about the outcomes you deliver, but I can't really talk about the workload that goes into creating that outcome.
Yeah, right. So let me ask you this for a second, Jacob. So we were talking about the incentive part of delivering for clients. We don't know what all the other partners do. Then the third is a technology challenge. And I like what you talked about here is rather than talk about what you do. And I would say this might be a framework or maybe a paradigm perspective, because we've all been taught, well, I'm an intellectual property litigator. I do patent litigation for Pharma, life science on the branded side. That's what I do. But instead, this might be would this be a training thing that leaders have to do with their people? So this is we're going down a different area here about, let's just call it paradigm shifts. I'm trying to get some structure. Let's call it the paradigm of how we have to think. And so tell me then, with this issue, is this paradigm issue an institutional issue or just the way it is across most professional services organizations?
It tends to be the way it is across most professional services organizations. And you asked if this is sort of a training thing. It's a key part of what we do in a lot of workshops is, instead of doing like an icebreaker, one of the icebreakers that we will institute is introduce the person next to you and tell me what problem they solve for clients.
Oh, that's
so
interesting.
I have to say, hi, this is Scott, and Scott finds lateral partners for firms when someone's looking to move or whatever, right? I come up with a pithy way of saying it. And so you start to learn the mechanism of introducing your peers.
Oh, wow.
I also think
that's great.
There's, and maybe for structure there, I think there's an interesting thing with training too, which is that pre-COVID, training oftentimes acted as what we call sidewalk coaching, which is to say you get brought to a pitch or you get brought to a client site and you have an hour long with the client or with the key person. And our chairman always jokes, the only thing you get to do in the first meeting is not pick your nose. And it's a joke, but you're just learning how to be in these meetings. And you walk outside the meeting and on the sidewalk, you say, Scott, what did you hear? And without fail, the partner heard 30 things that the associate did not hear in that meeting. And it builds this muscle for business development. But unfortunately, we had a pandemic and all of those activities atrophied. And increasingly, people are not quite as active on staying another night in the city and having dinner with a client or coming in early and having dinner. All of those kinds of skills have atrophied a little bit. Yeah. And so I think that there is a need for training in business development skill, particularly for new partners. But I don't think getting that training right is actually that easy.
Yeah, I would agree. And let me kind of come back to that in a second, because I've got a couple of questions and thoughts about that I think people would want to hear about. Let me go back over the institutional barriers that exist. The incentive part for delivering, we don't know everything partners do, the tech challenge, any other institutional barriers that you've seen from your years of experience in doing this?
I think one of the other ones, I don't know that I would call it an institutional barrier, but I think that the structure of the organization creates limitations. And there's a bunch of different, really interesting stuff going on here. So you know this too well, but all these professional service firms are in big matrices, right? So it's like we go first by industry, second by service line, third by geo, overlay of services or executives we serve or whatever, right? They're quite complex. And so without fail, those structures create difficulties in the way that we grow clients internally. And each flavor creates a different difficulty. But one of the fascinating things I think that's going on more so outside of legal right now is the impact that the profit creation engine takes on the organization. And what I mean by that is it a partnership with sort of, 1,000 partners who have their own P&Ls with all sort of a lot of little power centers everywhere? Or is it a company like an Accenture or a Cognizant that's gone public and faces public company scrutiny on a quarterly basis?
Right.
Because those institutions develop wildly different business development strategies.
Yeah. Let me make a comment, and I wanted to get your perspective on this. And when we talk about the structure of the organization, we're also talking about partner compensation. And is it open, meaning everybody knows what everybody else makes, or closed? Nobody knows. And I've had actually guests on here talk about partner comp. And this only relates to law firms, and maybe it relates to other professional services firms, I'm not sure. But he said, and I agree, that the best model is to have a closed comp, where the chairman or whoever the managing partner and that partner, that's it. Nobody else knows how much that person is making. Why is that good? It works because it takes out the variable of, gosh, what happens if I share my client? Now, there are two things you need to have for that to work. Number one, you have to trust your leadership. And number two, you have to trust your colleagues. That's why in some firms, if the trust isn't there, it's not going to work. So anyway, those are my thoughts. What do you think about that, Jacob? What's been your experience in terms of how that relates to sharing work?
I tend to agree because I've never thought that someone deserved to be paid more than me. I'm kidding, but I think that's a real issue in the world. Is like, I'm adding a lot of value. Why is Scott making more than me? And we all create value in different ways. An equally interesting question to me is, do you make public the contribution to business development at a partner level?
Oh, wait, tell me about that. Tell me about that. Say that again. Do you make public? Tell me that again, please.
Do you make public the compensation or the business development contribution of any given partner? So like a lot of firms now have been able to do this cool thing with their technology where each partner has a dashboard of their stuff, right? Their utilization, how many cases they have going on, what they've sold this year. And there is a decision that every firm confronts, which is, do I make this technology sortable? Can I sort myself to sort of stack rank myself against my peers in terms of my business development output? And I think the answer is, like every time in consulting, it depends. I think some firms probably need a little competitive kick in the butt. And the ability to search and see where you are in the force rank is one of the most impactful things. We all know that most of these partners make very good salaries, very good compensation. And so moving the needle with a little bit of incremental increase in comp is not always the most effective motivating factor.
Yeah.
But if you can search where you are against your peers and you're in the bottom third, you start to take action. And we have seen, firms will make it available. People will look at their rank and the bottom third instantly start taking on more business development activity. Like it is predictable future that they will do that. But it also creates problems. It creates people angry. It creates credit issues where you go, Scott didn't really actually sell that. He needed me, or I took that guy out to lunch that one time. And so my boss, Tom, who used to live in Africa for a long time, calls this the antelope down on the Serengeti. There's a new deal and everybody flies out of their office and says, I know him. I took her to lunch. I went to prep school with her. And you start to fight over credit instead of pushing the firm forward and growing. And so it's a balance, but sometimes it can be impactful and sometimes it can disrupt the culture.
Yeah. Wow. This is just definitely mind blowing what you're saying, Jacob, because these are things that I've seen a lot. And this also, I think, when it comes to some of these issues, this is that first thread off the sweater that starts being pulled. And if there's no trust in the organization, it's like you're not going to have a sweater left because everybody's going to leave. And
That's
then
right.
and then you're going to get critical mass. I don't want to be the last one here. I don't want to be read. I don't want to have my name in the press release of me, of one of 30 partners left at XYZ firm. That's why I think this is interesting. Professional services, especially big law firms, very interesting three-dimensional chess type organizations where one thing, it's the butterfly effect through the whole organization. If you tweak this here, wow, you might have 3 people leave a year later. And so how do you think leaders can mitigate the risk of unintended negative consequences when making these kind of changes in their organization?
Yeah. So I would just say proceed cautiously. So there's always a conversation when you're hiring people like, what is it? Hire slow, fire fast, hire slow, whatever it is. And I think the same is true with this. And I do think you can test some of this stuff out on a unit by unit level. Like you can roll this out to a practice group and see how they tolerate it before you roll it out to other people. So I think testing some of that. But I would say like my tendency is to lean harder on our culture than on competitive output. Like the culture matters, and really good cultures who are collegial, like working with each other, they develop business together. And I would just say that is probably more important than juicing the performance of the bottom third of your team. But again, it can be very useful in certain contexts.
That's interesting. Let me ask you about this. And I appreciate what you just said in terms of training partners to know how to make introductions, how to look for opportunities. I'll give you my own perspective on this. One of the things I've done, a recent change I made was changing my model to where I'm working on a retainer basis with a small number of firms. And part of that includes me training their partners on how to interview their firm, which really means how do you sell the opportunities to the people you want to hire? That's what an interview really is. And I'm good at being able to manage this nuance and earning their trust and talking to them in a way of doing it. But this is how I've explained it to some of the director level staff, is that a partner's correct client-facing persona is, I have all the answers. I know what to do. I know it all. I can solve your problem. That is the correct client-facing persona. The problem is that persona permeates itself into other areas of that professional, in other professional areas of his or her life. So let me ask you this. When you're teaching people how to do this, and by the way, have you seen that also? And how does someone like you manage that when you go into an organization and you're teaching them and training them? How do you share? How do you sell work? Things like that.
Yeah, so it's a hurdle. And I think one of the things I often do is I'm just very frank about the content. I'm like, there's business development content out there, and I have written a fair bit of it. It's not going to blow your hair back. It's all the stuff you already know. And what we're working on today in this training is not learning content or you listening to me go through slides. We're trying to turn the dial 20% on our business development performance. And the way we're going to do that today is through role play, through exercises to help you get used to introducing your colleagues, and other activities, including your suggestions for how the firm can support your crew a little better on business development. But the best outcomes, this Walt Schill character, the guy I'm writing the second book with, he's like 90% of our training should be role play. He's like, nobody likes it. And so we have another rule that we do, which is I do the first one. So I stand up in front of the room and I humiliate myself, introducing a colleague or trying to like sell a legal matter or whatever. And once I am up there and I laugh at myself, a lot of times the firm takes their guard down and they're willing to participate in a training that is not about me presenting how you're supposed to do it, but them actually engaging in the activities that drive business.
So you're getting partners in big fancy firms to do this.
Yes.
That's great.
One of the things we do that I love is we have this game that we used to play in our firm as like an icebreaker called justified or poor form. And so a lot of times I'll start a training with justified or poor form, and you'll put silly things on there like taking your shoes off on an airplane, and they'll vote justified or poor form. Like that's gross or that's not gross. Another one we do is like leaving the butter on the counter, counter versus fridge, justified or poor form. And then I always have the last one be justified or poor form, asking world-class lawyers to do a role play. That's and without fail, they say justified.
That's great.
Anyhow.
Wow. That's great. I mean, I like that the gravitas with self-deprecating humor and light professional humor. I think that's a good combination to get people like that on board, and they give you the answer. That's justified. We should do that. Oh, well, thanks for the idea. Let's talk about our next. Let's talk about what we're doing now.
Exactly.
Since you brought that up.
Exactly.
So tell me a story, and you don't need to mention the name of the firm. What were the problems that they had before you started working with them? What did you do in terms of addressing these institutional barriers, affecting the paradigm shift, and instituting, well, I don't know if you call it instituting training, but doing training? And what was the outcome? What's kind of the arc? What did they result? Yeah, what were their results?
Yeah, so I think the place where we have the biggest impact, and we do a bunch of these different kinds, is in new partner trainings. So I think the first thing that the first bridge to cross is your job has changed. They didn't teach you this in law school, and now you're a salesperson. I wrote a book called Never Say Sell, but you're a salesperson. Your job is to build a pyramid underneath you of productive, profitable work for the firm. And I think the most important thing that we do actually is we interview every person who participates in advance. So we know their proclivities, their concern areas, where they're really strong. And so I try to borrow credibility of the people in the room to say, and this last one I did, there was a great person in there who was very, sort of business development focused. And instead of saying, hey, you're a salesperson now, I called on him and I said, hey, you shared something in an interview about the importance of this class of people driving the growth of the firm in the future. Maybe you could share that. And so I'm borrowing his credibility to get my message in. And so we did a bunch of exercises, a bunch of workshops, and then we sent them off for 6 months to do it. And most importantly is you have to have accountability after the training. And so we did an hour-long, we always do this, but I'm thinking of one in particular. We did an hour-long session with those partners after their 6 months, and we were just honest with each other. What worked? Tell me a story about a pitch you lost. We had people telling stories about trying cold outreach, all kinds of stories coming out. And so what I find so interesting is oftentimes it's not the development of a hard skill. It's more like getting comfortable with doing it and giving each other the right to not be 100% successful. Partners in world-class law firms have been 100% successful at every single thing they've done since second grade. They get the best grades, they go to the best schools, and to sort of wade into some water where they're very uncomfortable, you kind of have to, I think, give them the right to not be perfect at it at first.
I think that's great. I think that's a really good style. And obviously, you know what you're doing. That's terrific. So tell me, how has this helped organizations? What were some of the results that you've seen from organizations like this that you've developed? Did they increase their revenue, or what were some of the metrics that you looked at along the way?
Always look at revenue increase. But I think more importantly, what I'm trying to look at is I like to look at, and we saw good results with this most recent one, is I like to look at the number of deals being proposed in that 6 months with multiple partners attached to it. Because when you first start doing business development, when you become a partner, you are only comfortable trying to go out there and win the work that you know. And if we're successful, our new cohort of people are working together as well as, with their other colleagues in the firm who are not in the new partner class to do that. One more addition I would add for training is just that getting the perspective of people who do it incredibly well is important. And so I did a separate training than the one I'm talking about, where we did, again, this is a great word, a rainmaker panel with 3 different senior partners. And we just talked about, how do you get referrals? How do you use references? How do you reach out to someone and ask for a piece of business? I think were the 3 ones. But learning from the people who came before them and who do it well is the ideal outcome. And so we're trying to, utilize a bunch of different techniques to engender that activity.
Yeah, wow. That's fantastic, Jacob. Well, before we go here, I want to ask you what I've done with every guest, 3 action steps. If there's a leader of a law firm or a professional services firm, whether it's large or small, they've got a team of people and their business depends on them sharing work, them being highly functional in that. If there were 3 action steps they can take to get started with these ideas that you've shared, what would those 3 action steps be?
Yeah, so I think one would be an evaluation of your current incentive system. And you have to ask yourself, do I have an incentive or do I have a bonus? So if you walk around and you ask your various partners, hey, what are we trying to incentivize you to do this year? And their response, like it often is, I don't really know how that works. I sort of just try to be successful with my matters, bring in some work and help my colleagues. And if I do that well, it usually works out. Well, that's a bonus. And that's okay. But an incentive is something completely different. An incentive drives specific behavior. So ask yourself, do I want to have a bonus where I'm just rewarding really good performance? Or am I trying to incentivize something very specific? And incentives don't have to be the same across the board. You can incentivize one practice unit to be better at cross-selling and one other one to make more connections. It's okay to have different incentives, but have a clear strategy on what you're trying to do as a firm in order to create that incentive.
That could be a whole topic. We'll have you back on and kind of go deep in that. So tell me about number 2, Jacob.
So I think number 2 would be, and this is a little bit more advice for an individual, but the way that firms become outstanding at winning work with existing clients is not more complex than curiosity. I want to understand every single thing that's going on in your business, not just whether or not there is like an ERISA litigation opportunity for me, but I want to understand your business because on some level, you're serving that client, but you're also serving that individual.
Yeah.
And you're helping that individual be successful in their job. And in order to do that, you have to understand how their priorities fit into the larger ecosystem and strategy of that business.
Exactly.
And really good consulting partners understand that and how their value fits into that person's roadmap.
That's great. Good. And what's number 3, Jake?
Help your colleagues. If you're senior, mentor younger partners and help them learn business development. Make introductions. Reach out to them and ask them about their practice. This stuff is sort of like rolling a log down a hill. It can be hard to get started, but once you build the cultural fabric of curiosity, wondering what people are up to, trying to bring other partners in, it's huge. I always ask when I do these trainings, I say, presumably you have an all-firm meeting coming up, right? Where you're all going to be in a place together. And presumably you do the same thing that so many attorneys do, which is you spend your time with the 5 people you know from your office. And I would challenge all of you at each meal to sit at a table where you don't know anybody and ask them what they do in their practice. And that will actually have a big impact on business development in the future, much larger than you think. So help your colleagues and be curious about how they sort of add value for their clients too.
These are great ideas, Jacob. And one thing I've seen is that these are simple ideas. They're important. They're not overarching, impossible goals. It's something that you just have to do. But then again, we're dealing with people, and that's the hard part, right?
That's right.
And that's where your company's expertise comes in, taking these fuzzy ideas into results and bridging that gap. So tell us about your company, about your offerings. What would you like our listeners to know about what your company does, Jacob?
Yeah, so we spun out of Anderson just right before the Enron debacle. So we've been
and it was Profitable Ideas Exchange. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Profitable Ideas Exchange. And many of our clients just refer to us as PI.
Got it.
But we basically want to be helpful to the entire spectrum of growth. So, all the way from thinking about structure, incentive, training, even going as far as sort of segmentation and who we should be serving, and all the way through the value chain of business development, whether that's, so one thing that I find to be one of my favorite projects is like an event audit. So I think one of the things we do as firms is we go to an event every year because we're supposed to go to it. And we show up and we have a nice time and maybe we're not as focused as we should be on outcomes. And so one of the ways we've helped clients is to go in and to do an audit of what is the actual ROI of these different events that you're spending money on. And not to say these are good or these are bad, but to go one of 2 ways. One is we're not going to this event anymore. It doesn't attract the right people. We're gonna take that investment and we're gonna deploy it somewhere else. Or 2, this is a good event, but we're just not getting our ROI out of it. And here is the plan, the playbook for getting meetings in advance, meeting senior people, and not just wandering around the conference hall grabbing stress balls. Because there's really no big opportunities on that conference hall, right? Like the opportunities happen at dinners and breakfasts outside of the conference.
Wow, that's great. And how do you report back to the leaders of your clients on that?
Yeah, and I think there's an interview process that goes along with it, right? Which is, why do you want to go to this? How are you utilizing this? Who's attending? How much does it cost? All of those kinds of things. Because, there are some events where there is just such a dominant event in a particular industry where you can rightfully say, we're not getting any sort of business development ROI out of there, but we have to be there. It's just, we have to be at that event. And that's okay too. But there are many events we invest in that we definitely don't need to be going to.
Yeah, I get that. Well, that's great. Well, this is good. I'm really glad you're on the show today, Jacob. I want to have you back on later on. I'll put your book link information on the show notes. Everybody that's listening, if you want to connect with Jacob, just go to the show notes wherever you listen to this podcast. and you'll be able to connect with him directly. Thanks again, Jacob. Good job. And I look forward to having you back on the show in the future.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Rainmaking Podcast. For more information about our recruiting services for international law firms, visit our website at attorneysearchgroup.com. To inquire about having Scott speak at your next convention, conference, sales meeting, or executive retreat, visit the rainmakingpodcast.com.